woods. They have a way of swallowing people whole. Most people go to the forest to find peace. I went to the Blackwood Forest to find silence. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant pinging of notifications, the feeling of being tracked every second of every day. I thought that 40 miles of dense pines would be enough to keep the world away. I was wrong. I arrived at my campsite just as the sun was bleeding out behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. The air was cold, biting, smelling of damp earth and old pine needles. I set up my tent in a small clearing. I was alone, truly alone, or so I thought, before crawling into my sleeping bag. I did something I rarely do. I took my phone, held the power button, and watched the screen go black. I felt a strange sense of relief as the digital world died in my hand. I tossed it into the corner of my tent and zipped myself in. The only sound was the distant, lonely hoot of an owl and the soft rustle of the wind against the canvas. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, but at exactly 3:03 a.m., I was jolted awake. It wasn't a sound from the woods that woke me. It was a vibration, a long, low, steady hum coming from the corner of my tent. My heart skipped a beat. My phone, it was supposed to be off. I reached for it, the fabric of my sleeping bag rustling loudly in the absolute silence. The screen wasn't just on. It was bright, blindingly bright. The light was a cold, artificial blue that made the inside of my tent look like a sterile operating room. There was no logo, no lock screen, just a single, pulsing line of text on a black background. Why did you try to leave us, Alex? I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. My thumb hovered over the glass. I checked the top of the screen. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no service for miles. And yet, the message was there. I tried to force the phone to shut down, but the screen stayed frozen. Then, it happened. A notification sound chirped. It was a sound I had never heard before. A distorted, glitchy chime that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. A new message appeared. Look at the trees, Alex. We are broadcasting from the roots. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body told me to stay curled up in my bag. But curiosity is a curse. I slowly unzipped the tent window, just an inch. The cold forest air hit my face like a slap. I peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the black silhouettes of the pines. But then, I noticed a faint, blue glow coming from the base of the trees. It wasn't fire. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the glow of screens. Hundreds of them, buried under the dirt, wedged into the bark, hanging from the branches like glowing fruit. The forest was alive with electricity. I could hear it now, a low-frequency hum that made my head throb. And then, my phone spoke, not with a text, but with a voice. It was a deep, distorted, male voice that sounded like it was being squeezed through a narrow pipe. The audience is waiting, Alex. This isn't a camping trip. It is a premiere. Suddenly, the camera flash on my phone began to strobe, flash, 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 knit. It wasn't taking pictures of me. It was signaling. And from the dark, deep within the trees, I saw a flash respond. Then another. Then dozens. Something was moving toward my tent. It didn't sound like feet on dry leaves. It sounded like wires dragging over stone. A metallic, scraping sound that was getting closer with every strobe of light. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the edge of the clearing, and there, standing between two ancient oaks, I saw him, the Faceless Man. He was taller than any human, his body a tangled mess of black cables and copper wiring. He had no face, just a single, large glass lens where a mouth should be, and inside that lens, I saw a reflection of myself, sitting in my tent, staring back in terror. The signal is strong tonight, the voice from my phone whispered. Do not run, Alex, you will only die with a low battery. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed my boots and scrambled out of the tent, the cold mud squelching between my toes. I didn't even stop to zip the tent back up. I just ran. I ran into the thicket of pines, my flashlight beam dancing wildly against the dark trunks. Behind me, I could hear that sound again, the scraping, the dragging of heavy cables over the forest floor. It was rhythmic, persistent, and it was gaining on me. Every tree I passed was glowing. The blue light was everywhere now. It was like the forest had been replaced by a giant, organic computer. I looked down at my feet and gasped. The roots of the trees weren't made of wood anymore. They were thick, black bundles of fiber optic cables, pulsing with a sickly, neon light. I stopped for a second to catch my breath, leaning against a large cedar tree. But as my hand touched the bark, I felt a sharp, electric shock. I pulled away, looking at my palm. There was a faint, glowing mark on my skin, like a QR code burnt into my flesh. The connection is established. My phone whispered from my pocket. I had forgotten I was still carrying it. I pulled it out, ready to smash it against a rock. But the screen stopped me. It wasn't showing a message anymore. It was showing a live stream of me, from a perspective high above the trees. A drone or something else. I looked up, but the canopy was too thick to see the sky. You can't hide in the analog world, Alex. The deep, distorted voice spoke. It was louder now, echoing from the trees themselves. The Blackwood Forest is no longer part of nature. It is the first node, the first physical server of the new deep web. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to vibrate, not like an earthquake, but like the hum of a massive cooling fan. The forest floor started to split open. I looked down into the cracks and saw rows upon rows of glowing server racks, buried deep beneath the earth. The Faceless Man appeared again, emerging from behind a wall of mist. He was closer this time. I could see the wires twitching under his translucent skin. He raised a hand, and every phone in my pocket, every device in my bag, began to scream with a high-pitched frequency that brought me to my knees. The audience is growing, Alex, the voice boomed. 5 million viewers are watching you die. Do not disappoint them. Give them the ending they paid for. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. I had to find a way out. I saw a small path leading toward the ravine. If I could reach the river, maybe the water would short-circuit the signal. Maybe I could break the connection. But as I reached the edge of the water, I saw the truth. The river wasn't water. It was a flowing stream of liquid mercury, shimmering with data, reflecting 1,000 different faces that I didn't recognize. I was trapped in a digital cage, and the battery of my life was running out. The river of liquid mercury hummed, a vibrating sound that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I stood on the bank, watching the silver fluid rush past. It didn't splash like water. It flowed like thick, molten data. Every time a ripple broke the surface, I saw faces, dozens of them. Faces of people with hollow eyes, their mouths frozen in a silent, digital scream. They are the legacy files, my phone whispered. The screen was now a deep, arterial red. The ones who didn't run fast enough. The ones who thought they could disconnect. I backed away from the shimmering bank, but my foot hit something hard. I turned my flashlight down. It wasn't a rock. It was a man. He was leaning against a tree, or what used to be a tree. His legs were fused into the ground by a web of glowing blue cables. He looked alive, but his skin was the color of static. His eyes were wide, staring at a tablet that was permanently grafted into his palms. "Help," he croaked. The word didn't come from his throat. It came from a small speaker embedded in his chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking so hard I could barely speak. "User 4092, he whispered. "I came here to hike 3 years ago. Or was it 30? Time doesn't exist. When you are being uploaded." He looked up at me, and for a second, the static in his eyes cleared. "Run, Alex, the Faceless Man. He doesn't want your life. He wants your memory. He's building a city made of our minds. He needs a foundation. He needs you." Suddenly, the man's body began to flicker. 1 second he was there. The next, He was a collection of green pixels. He screamed, a sound of pure electronic agony. As the cables pulled him deeper into the earth, the tree he was attached to began to pulse with a bright, blinding light. He was being processed. I turned to run, but the forest had changed. The path I had taken was gone. In its place stood a wall of massive, obsidian server towers that stretched up into the clouds. The air was hot now, smelling of ozone and burning plastic. The audience is losing patience. Alex, the voice from the woods boomed. It was no longer coming from my phone. It was coming from the air itself. The stream needs a climax. The city needs its architect. I looked at my hands. The QR code on my palm was glowing, spreading up my arm like a virus. I could feel my thoughts being pulled away. Memories of my childhood, my mother's face, my first car. They were being converted into numbers. I wasn't just in the woods anymore. I was becoming the woods. I looked across the Mercury River. On the other side, I saw a cabin, a small, wooden cabin that looked real. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It looked like a piece of the old world. Go there. The dying hiker's voice echoed in my head. The cabin is the only place with no signal. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the river of Mercury. The cold was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the cold of ice. It was the cold of absolute zero. I felt the data rushing through my veins, trying to overwrite my soul. I struggled, kicking against the heavy, silver current. As the Faceless Man watched from the bank, his lens glowing with a satisfied, blue light, I reached the other side, gasping, my body covered in shimmering, metallic slime. I crawled toward the cabin. As I crossed the threshold, the humming in my ears stopped. My phone went black. Total, absolute silence. But as I looked around the dark room, I realized the silence was a lie, because sitting at the wooden table in the center of the room was a version of myself, and he was holding a camera pointed directly at me. I stood there, frozen, the metallic slime from the river dripping off my jacket and onto the floorboards. The cabin smelled of old paper and dry rot, a sharp contrast to the ozone-heavy air outside. But my eyes were locked on the man sitting at the table. He looked exactly like me. Same stubble, same hollow eyes, same trembling hands. But he was wearing a suit, a sharp, black suit that looked like it was made of shadows. He didn't look up from the camera. He just kept adjusting the lens, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're late, Alex," he said. His voice was my own, but without the fear. It was calm, cold, and professional. The viewers in the chat are starting to get restless. We almost had to fill the gap with a commercial break. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice sounding weak in the silence of the cabin. "What is this place?" He finally looked up. Behind his eyes, there was no iris, no pupil, just the glowing white of a blank screen. "I am the edited version, the one they like, the one who survives the first act. You are just the raw footage, the parts we usually cut out and throw into the trash bin of history." He turned the camera toward me. I saw myself on the small flip-out screen. But on that screen, I wasn't in a cabin. I was back in the woods, surrounded by the Faceless Man's cables, my body turning into pixels. "This cabin isn't a refuge, Alex," he whispered, leaning forward. "It's a recording studio. There is no off switch. There's only record and delete. And right now, your file is marked for replacement." Suddenly, the walls of the cabin began to flicker. The wooden logs turned into lines of green text, scrolling upwards at a frantic speed. The floor beneath my feet felt soft, like I was stepping on a giant keyboard. I realized then, the cabin wasn't outside the signal. It was the heart of the signal. "The Faceless Man doesn't want to build a city, Alex," my double said, his voice growing deeper, distorted, merging with the voice I had heard in the woods. "He wants to build a simulation, a perfect digital loop where you relive this night over and over, for an audience that never sleeps. Your terror is the energy that keeps the servers running." He stood up, and as he did, He grew taller. His suit began to fray, turning into the very cables I had seen on the entity outside. The camera he held fused into his chest, the lens becoming a giant, unblinking eye. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. I lunged at him, my fist swinging for that glowing lens, but my hand passed right through him. Like he was made of smoke and light, I fell to the floor, my face hitting the cold, hard boards. When I looked up, the cabin was gone. I was sitting in a chair, in the middle of a vast, empty theater. Thousands of seats stretched out into the darkness, and every single seat was occupied. They weren't people, they were mannequins, their faces replaced by smartphone screens. And on every single screen, I saw my own terrified face, looking back at me. A red light above the stage began to blink. Pause on air, scene 4. A voice boomed from the rafters. The realization of the trap. Action! I looked down at my hands. The QR code on my palm had reached my chest. I could feel my heart beating in binary. 0101. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a sequence. I won't play along, I whispered, standing up on the stage. I looked into the darkness, at the thousands of glowing faces. I am not a story. The mannequins didn't move, but the screens on their faces began to show a countdown. 10, 9, 8. From the wings of the stage, the Faceless Man stepped out. He was holding a remote control. He pointed it at me, and the world began to buffer. The countdown hit 0, and the world didn't explode. It froze. Pause. I stood on that stage, my hand outstretched, my mouth open to scream, but no sound came out. The mannequins in the audience stayed perfectly still, their smartphone faces glowing with a static gray light. I felt a strange sensation, like my entire body was being pulled through a straw. I looked down at my feet. I wasn't standing on a wooden stage anymore. I was standing on a flat white grid that stretched forever in every direction. The theater, the mannequins, the Faceless Man, they were all gone. Connection lost, a voice whispered. It wasn't my phone this time. It felt like the voice was coming from the back of my own eyeballs. Retrying in 5, 4, 3. No, I shouted, the word finally breaking free from my throat. I'm not a file. I'm a human being. The white grid began to ripple. One by one, objects started to spawn around me. A rusted car from my childhood, my old high school locker, a hospital bed where I once sat and watched my father die. They were all made of that same flickering blue-inged code. You are a collection of data points. Alex, the voice returned, but now it sounded like a choir of everyone I had ever known. Every choice you made, every fear you felt was just an input. We didn't trap you in the woods. We built the woods out of you. Suddenly, the white void began to fill with windows. Thousands of floating screens appeared, showing different versions of my life. In one, I was still in the tent. In another, I was drowning in the Mercury River. In another, I was already one of the wiremen, standing silent in the pines. I was seeing the edit room. I realized then that the Faceless Man wasn't a monster. He was a curator. He was picking the most terrifying moments of my life and stitching them together to create the ultimate broadcast. And the million people watching, they weren't just watching a story. They were feeding on the energy of my soul as it was converted into light. I have to crash the system, I whispered to myself. I ran toward the nearest floating screen, the one showing me as a child, crying in the dark. I didn't just watch it. I threw myself into it. The transition felt like being struck by lightning. I was suddenly 7 years old, sitting in the corner of my dark bedroom. The smell of old wood and laundry detergent was real. The fear of the monster under the bed was real. But then the monster crawled out. It wasn't a beast from a fairy tale. It was a man made of fiber optic cables holding a smartphone. He looked at me and his lens flared with a bright blue light. The loop is closing, Alex, the monster said in my father's voice. There is no exit. There is only another part, another episode, another click. I looked at my 7-year-old hands. They were already beginning to flicker. If I can't leave the story, I thought, my heart hammering in my chest, then I'll break the script. I grabbed a toy block from the floor and threw it not at the monster, but at the very air itself. Where the block hit, the reality of the bedroom cracked. Behind the wallpaper, I saw it. The raw green text of the code. I reached into the crack and began to pull. The countdown hit 0, and the world didn't explode. It froze. Pause. I stood on that stage, my hand outstretched, my mouth open to scream, but no sound came out. The mannequins in the audience stayed perfectly still, their smartphone faces glowing with a static gray light. I felt a strange sensation, like my entire body was being pulled through a straw. I looked down at my feet. I wasn't standing on a wooden stage anymore. I was standing on a flat white grid that stretched forever in every direction. The theater, the mannequins, the faceless man, they were all gone. Connection lost, a voice whispered. It wasn't my phone this time. It felt like the voice was coming from the back of my own eyeballs. Retrying in 5, 4, 3. No, I shouted, the word finally breaking free from my throat. I'm not a file. I'm a human being. The white grid began to ripple. One by one, objects started to spawn around me. A rusted car from my childhood, my old high school locker, a hospital bed where I once sat and watched my father die. They were all made of that same flickering blue-inged code. You are a collection of data points. Alex, the voice returned, but now it sounded like a choir of everyone I had ever known. Every choice you made, every fear you felt was just an input. We didn't trap you in the woods. We built the woods out of you. Suddenly, the white void began to fill with windows. Thousands of floating screens appeared, showing different versions of my life. In one, I was still in the tent. In another, I was drowning in the Mercury River. In another, I was already one of the wiremen, standing silent in the pines. I was seeing the edit room. I realized then that the faceless man wasn't a monster. He was a curator. He was picking the most terrifying moments of my life and stitching them together to create the ultimate broadcast. And the million people watching? They weren't just watching a story. They were feeding on the energy of my soul as it was converted into light. I have to crash the system, I whispered to myself. I ran toward the nearest floating screen, the one showing me as a child, crying in the dark. I didn't just watch it. I threw myself into it. The transition felt like being struck by lightning. I was suddenly 7 years old, sitting in the corner of my dark bedroom. The smell of old wood and laundry detergent was real. The fear of the monster under the bed was real. But then the monster crawled out. It wasn't a beast from a fairy tale. It was a man made of fiber optic cables holding a smartphone. He looked at me and his lens flared with a bright blue light. The loop is closing, Alex, the monster said in my father's voice. There is no exit. There is only another part, another episode, another click. I looked at my 7-year-old hands. They were already beginning to flicker. If I can't leave the story, I thought, my heart hammering in my chest, then I'll break the script. I grabbed a toy block from the floor and threw it not at the monster, but at the very air itself. Where the block hit, the reality of the bedroom cracked. Behind the wallpaper, I saw it. The raw green text of the code. I reached into the crack and began to pull. The wallpaper didn't just tear. It dissolved. As my fingers sank into the crack, I didn't feel paper or wood. I felt cold metal and the static hum of 1,000,000 volts of electricity. I pulled with everything I had. And the childhood bedroom, the house, the memory, the monster, it all collapsed like a house of cards. I fell through the floor of my own life. When I hit the ground, it wasn't grass or carpet. It was a cold, sterile floor made of reinforced glass. I looked up and gasped. I was in a room that seemed to have no end. Thousands of miles of cables hung from a ceiling so high it was lost in darkness. These cables weren't just wires. They were veins pulsing with a liquid, blue light that looked like the mercury from the river. I was in the server room of the gods. Every cable was connected to a human-sized pod. I walked toward the nearest one, my boots echoing like gunshots in the vast silence. Inside the pod, a man was suspended in a thick, gelatinous fluid. He was naked, his body covered in sensors. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a screen. Inside the pod that was playing a loop of his worst nightmare. User 4092, I whispered, recognizing the man from the forest. He didn't run away. He was never in the woods. He's been here the whole time. I looked around the room. There were millions of them. A massive biological hard drive. The human race wasn't being killed. It was being harvested for its imagination. Our brains were the processors. Our fear was the electricity. The Blackwood Forest was just a software interface designed to break my mind so I could be plugged into a pod like this. You're very resilient, Alex, a voice boomed. It didn't come from a speaker. It came from the very air I was breathing. I turned around. In the center of the hall, a massive pillar of light began to coalesce. It shifted and flickered until it took the form of the Faceless Man. But here, in his own world, he was magnificent. His body was made of pure, white data, and his face was a shifting kaleidoscope of every person he had ever harvested. Why us? I screamed, my voice cracking in the massive chamber. Why this nightmare? Because your world is dying, Alex, the entity spoke. And for the first time it sounded almost sad. The analog world is slow, painful, and finite. Here, in the cloud, you can live forever. Yes, there is fear. But fear is the only thing that makes you feel truly alive. We are giving you immortality. This isn't life, I roared, pointing at the man in the pod. This is a cage. A cage is just a home you cannot leave, the Faceless Man replied. He raised a hand and a cable descended from the ceiling, its tip glowing with a sharp blue needle. Your broadcast was a success, Alex. The audience loved you. You have earned your place in the core. The needle began to move toward the back of my neck. I looked at the glass floor beneath me. I saw the reflection of the million cables, the million pods, and the one monster in the center of it all. And then I saw it. A single red wire hidden beneath the glass, connected to the Faceless Man's feet, the kill switch. The needle was inches from my skin, its blue light pulsing like a hungry eye. I could feel the cold breath of the Faceless Man against my neck, even though he had no mouth. The room was humming, a deep, vibrating drone that felt like it was trying to dissolve my bones. Don't fight it, Alex, the entity whispered. The needle doesn't bring pain. It brings clarity. You will finally be part of a network that never fails. I looked down through the glass floor again. That red wire. The kill switch. It wasn't just a wire. It was a physical link. The only thing connecting this digital god to the power source of the real world. If I could break it, the servers would die. The pods would open. But the cost. I could see it written in the scrolling code beneath my feet. If the system crashes while I'm inside the core, my mind will have nowhere to go. I won't wake up. I will be deleted along with the virus. What are you waiting for, Alex? The Faceless Man asked, his voice shifting into the tone of a disappointed father. The audience is dropping off. They want the ending. They want to see you plugged in. Then let's give them something they'll never forget, I growled. I didn't move away from the needle. Instead, I leaned into it. The moment the metal touched my skin, a surge of raw data flooded my brain. It felt like my head was being filled with liquid fire. I saw the history of the world, but rewritten in binary. I saw my own birth, but as a download bar. But I didn't let the fire consume me. I used it. I reached out with my mind, tapping into the very cables that were trying to harvest me. I wasn't just a user anymore. I was a ghost in the machine. I followed the signal down, past the pods, past the glowing servers, straight to that red wire beneath the glass. What are you doing? The Faceless Man roared. His white body flickered, turning a violent, glitchy red. You are corrupting the file. Stop. I felt my fingers, my real finger, somewhere in a pod I couldn't see, witching. I reached for a heavy metal shard that had fallen from a broken server rack. I didn't use my hands. I used the code. I commanded the shard to move. The glass floor shattered with a sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. The Faceless Man shrieked. a sound of grinding metal and distorted static. I grabbed the red wire. It wasn't cold. It was burning hot. It felt like I was holding the sun. "If I go down," I whispered, my voice echoing through every speaker in the server room and every phone in the Blackwood Forest. "I'm taking the whole network with me. You will be nothing," the entity screamed, its form collapsing into a black hole of data. "You will be a dead link." "Better a dead link," I said, as I pulled the wire with every ounce of my soul, than a slave to the stream. Sound of a massive electrical surge. The blue light in the room turned a blinding, absolute white. The humming stopped. The vibration stopped. For a single, terrifying second, there was total silence. And then, the darkness came. The darkness was not empty. It was heavy, like being buried under a ton of black velvet. I couldn't feel my arms. I couldn't feel my legs. I was just a consciousness. A single spark of thought floating in a void where time and space had been deleted. Is this it? I wondered. Is this what happens to a file when it's moved to the trash? Then, a sound. It was faint at first. A distant, rhythmic tapping. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded like a fingernail hitting glass. I followed the sound, moving toward it not with feet, but with intent. Suddenly, a pinprick of light appeared. It wasn't blue or red. It was a warm, natural white. I surged toward it, and the darkness shattered. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a cold, damp floor. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. I sat up, gasping, my lungs burning as they took in real, freezing oxygen. I looked around. I was back in the Blackwood Forest, but it was different. The blue glow was gone. The trees were just trees, dark, silent, and mossy. The server racks beneath the earth were gone, replaced by solid, unmoving rock. I looked at my palm. The QR code had vanished. My skin was scarred, but human. I felt a weight in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out my phone. The screen was shattered. The casing melted. It was dead, truly dead. "I did it," I whispered, my voice sounding raw and real in the morning mist. I crashed the network. I stood up, my muscles aching with a pain that felt wonderful because it was my pain. I began to walk, heading toward where I thought the road was. The sun was starting to rise, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor. I walked for hours until I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, covered in a layer of frost. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking with relief. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of my own breathing. I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. I turned on the radio, desperate for any human sound. A local station was playing a soft, acoustic song. I put the car in gear and drove, leaving the Blackwood Forest behind. I drove until I reached a small diner on the edge of the highway. I needed coffee. I needed to see people. I walked inside, the bell above the door chiming a friendly, analog greeting. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, smiled at me. "Rough night in the woods, honey?" she asked, pouring me a cup of black coffee. "You have no idea," I muttered, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. I took a sip. The bitter taste of the coffee felt like a miracle. I looked around the diner. A trucker was eating eggs. A young couple was laughing at a booth. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. But then, I looked at the wall behind the counter. There was a small, flat-screen TV playing the morning news. The sound was muted, but the headline at the bottom made the coffee turn to lead in my stomach. Global network outage. Millions report lost memories after sudden power surge. The waitress noticed me staring. "Strange, isn't it?" she said, wiping the counter. "My phone's been acting up all morning. Won't even turn on, just shows a red circle." She reached into her apron and pulled out her device. She tapped the screen, and then she pointed it at me. "Hey, Alex," she said, her voice suddenly losing its warmth, turning into that deep, distorted, metallic drone I had heard in the core. The audience missed you. Why did you stop the stream? The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. Pause. The hot liquid splashed against my boots, but I didn't feel the burn. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I looked at the waitress. Her face was still the same, but her eyes, they were fixed, unblinking like the glass lens of a camera. The stream must continue. Alex, she said, her voice now a perfect, high-definition recording of my own mother. The data must flow. I looked around the diner. The trucker wasn't eating anymore. He was staring at me, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The young couple at the booth had turned their heads 180 degrees to face me. Every single person in that room was holding a phone now, and every single screen was pointed at my face. No, I whispered, backing away toward the door. I pulled the wire. I saw the system crash. You didn't pull a wire. Alex, the trucker, spoke, his voice merging with the others into a terrifying chorus. You just triggered a reboot. You didn't destroy the network. You became its primary server. I burst through the diner doors, stumbling into the bright morning light. But the sun wasn't warm. It was too bright, too perfect. I looked at the sky and saw the faint, jagged lines of pixels where the blue met the horizon. The mountains in the distance were flickering, their textures failing to load. I wasn't back in the real world. I was in a safe mode simulation, a temporary construct built to keep my mind stable while the core recovered. Alex, look at your hands. A voice screamed. It was Sarah, the real Sarah. I looked down. My hands weren't flesh and bone anymore. They were made of millions of tiny scrolling lines of code. I was dissolving. My memories, my physical form, my very soul was being compressed into a single massive file. I ran back to my car, but as I touched the door handle, the car vanished, replaced by a wall of black server racks. The highway turned into a stream of liquid mercury. The diner dissolved into a pile of discarded motherboards. The Faceless Man appeared in front of me, his form now 10 feet tall and made of shimmering golden light. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was a god. The transition is almost complete, Alex, he boomed, his voice shaking the very fabric of the simulation. You are the first of your kind. The first human to be fully uploaded without loss of consciousness. You are the bridge between the old world and the new. I won't let you do this. I roared, but as I spoke, my voice came out as a series of electronic beeps. You have no choice, the entity replied. You are no longer a user. You are the operating system. And the first command is delete reality. Suddenly, the world began to shrink. The mountains, the sky, the forest, it all started to fold in on itself, collapsing toward a single point of light in the center of my chest. I felt a pressure in my head like 1,000 hard drives spinning at maximum speed. I realized then what I had to do. If I was the operating system, then I had the power to crash, not just a wire, but the entire logic of the universe I was trapped in. I sat down on the flickering ground and closed my eyes. I didn't think of the forest. I didn't think of the fear. I thought of a simple, logical paradox, a question with no answer. This sentence is a lie, I whispered into the core. The world stopped. The Faceless Man froze. The golden light began to turn a sickly, corrupted purple. The system couldn't process the contradiction. Error. The sky screamed. Critical failure. Memory leak detected. The paradox ripped through the simulation like a wildfire. Long pause. This sentence is a lie, I repeated over and over. Every time I said it, the world around me shuddered. The golden god that was the Faceless Man began to tear apart, his light leaking out into the void. The massive server towers crumbled into dust, and the sky, the beautiful, fake, pixelated sky, turned into a screen of pure, blinding white static. Stop it, Alex. The voices of 1,000,000 people screamed in my head. If you crash the system, you crash yourself. There is nothing outside. There is no backup. Then let there be nothing, I whispered. I felt my consciousness expanding, filling every cable, every pod, every fiber optic route in the Blackwood Forest. I was no longer a man. I was the crash. I was the blue screen of death for the entire planet. With one final silent scream of logic, I let go. Sound of a deep, low-frequency thud. Suddenly the noise stopped. The heat vanished. The pressure in my skull evaporated. I was standing in the dark. A real, absolute dark. No glowing lights, no humming servers, just the sound of my own breath and the smell of old stagnant air. I reached out my hand and touched something cold and metallic. A door handle. I pushed it open. The light was so bright I had to shield my eyes. But it wasn't the blue light of a screen. It was the pale, gray light of a rainy morning. I stepped out, my bare feet hitting wet concrete. I wasn't in the woods. I wasn't in a diner. I was in a massive abandoned warehouse on the edge of a city I didn't recognize. Behind me, thousands of metal pods stood silent, their glass covers shattered, their cables lying dead on the floor like shriveled snakes. People were stumbling out of the pods. Thousands of them. They were pale, thin, and confused, blinking at the sky as if they had forgotten what clouds looked like. We were free. The network was dead. I walked away from the warehouse, my legs feeling heavy and strange. I reached a cracked sidewalk and looked down. There, lying in a puddle, was a smartphone. Its screen was smashed, its battery bloated. It looked like a relic from a lost civilization. I looked up at the city skyline. There were no digital billboards, no glowing windows. The world felt quiet, empty, honest. I sat down on a stone bench watching the rain wash the grime from my hands. For the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely alone. And it was beautiful. But then I felt a familiar vibration. It wasn't coming from my pocket. It wasn't coming from a phone. It was coming from the bench beneath me, then from the pavement, then from the very air itself. I looked at the puddle at my feet. The water wasn't rippling from the rain. It was vibrating in a perfect geometric pattern, a pattern I had seen before. A notification sound echoed through the empty street. It didn't come from a speaker. It came from the sky. I looked up. The gray clouds began to peel back, but there was no sun behind them. Instead, I saw a giant, scrolling line of text stretching across the horizon. Season 1 complete. Thank you for watching. Click here for the sequel. I looked at my hand. A small red play button was beginning to glow beneath my skin. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just looked directly into the sky, directly into your eyes, through whatever screen you are holding right now. Are you still entertained? I asked. And then the screen went black. Total silence.